So what is problem-based learning? Problem-based learning, or PBL, is, as the name also says, learning that is traditionally understood as a method that organizes the curricular content around problem scenarios rather than subjects or disciplines. So this traces back to educational scholars from the early 20th century. It developed as a practical tool in the 1960s in Canada at McMaster in the context of medical education. There was a perceived lack of application of theory, so the teaching staff wanted to teach theory in a real-life context and bring the education closer to the students, hence starting the learning with problems. Many PBL approaches have a student-centered approach to education in which the students direct their learning in a way that allows to solve or understand a problem that may be from academia or the professional world, for example. So in the context of medical education, these problems were usually descriptions of patient symptoms, and the students had to research and read the theory in order to find out how to actually treat that patient. So the learning was kind of starting from this problem of, a sick patient, and the learning then took place in a student-centered way and in a contextual manner. While there are many ways to go about this when you want to put this to practice, Maastricht University developed the so-called 7-step approach, which is one way and a very clearly structured way to go about this. And that's the main thing that I will be talking about today. So basically, it starts with teaching writing a problem description. So usually that is a text, but it may also take the form or shape of a video or some sort of presentation, or a photo or a graph or something like that. And usually that is indeed a problem that is common to the field. So for medicine, those might be, for example, symptoms. For law students, those might be legal cases. For philosophy students, it might be an ethical dilemma. And depending on the level of the problem, whether you want students to acquire knowledge or to discuss or have an ethical discussion, that's also the way in which you then phrase the problem. The tutorials in general are split in half. So you have a preliminary discussion and for 1 hour, let's say on Monday, and then a post discussion for 1 hour, let's say on Tuesday. And then you will be kind of in the second half of your tutorial on Thursday, pre-discussing the next tutorial on Thursday. That's kind of the very practical general structure. And in the pre-discussion, you have the first 5 steps. So students receive the problem task, the problem description, and they begin reading the problem task and clarifying any unclear terms. They then define a problem statement. So the problem statement is usually a question that summarizes the main problem of the task. And then students proceed to brainstorm and discuss the problem statement based on prior knowledge. So basically, students begin trying to answer the problem statement, seeing what they already know, where they might have knowledge gaps, and on the one hand, activating prior knowledge, but also starting to figure out the puzzle pieces that they need to answer the problem statement. After the brainstorm, they start clustering the notes on the board. So usually you have a note taker during that time, during the brainstorm, who writes down unstructured notes, and then afterwards you cluster the notes on the board into several topics and identify knowledge gaps. And those knowledge gaps and those groups of topics are then grouped into learning goals that guide the research. So you phrase new questions, usually that's about like 4 to 6 questions that the students present or ask themselves in order to structure their reading for the next task. Depending on the level of the course, students are either provided with literature or search their own literature for the 6th step, which is the self-study. So depending on how long the interval between the pre and the post discussion is, that might be more or less pages. It might be a video or a documentary. It might be a lecture that students can attend. So in one or the other way, they gather knowledge in order to answer the learning goals and ultimately the problem statement. which is also what they will then be doing in that Thursday tutorial in a post discussion, where they answer or they bring up the findings from their self-study and try to answer the learning goals. So they may see if they can better address the initial problem statement. So basically the answer to the learning goals that they outlined in step 5 will then help answering the problem statement from step 2, which is the overarching aim of the task. So specifically, this is a similar presentation of this where you can see a bit more clearly. So these are the 5 first steps of the pre-discussion, where you clarify the concepts, you define the problem, analyze the problem, and have some sort of brainstorming to activate prior knowledge. There's a problem analysis or a systematic classification, so that's what we call clustering. And then there's the formulation of learning objective, which guides the self-study, and then the final discussion or sort of reporting to answer the problem or find some sort of solutions to the problem that was outlined. So for a medical case, again, that might be on the one hand being able to identify the illness. Maybe there's some experiments on what sort of treatment might be useful. Similarly, for law students, they might read comparisons and then bring it back to the initial case, or philosophy students might read some, if they read, for example, if they are talking about conceptions of justice, they read conceptions of justice and then bring in some different accounts of justice than maybe their initial ones, or theories, begin talking about theories. So the general discussion is not really guided by the tutor, but it is organized by a discussion leader. So the tutor's role is more or less to make sure that the group stays on track with regards to the content, so that there's not blatantly false information. Whereas the discussion leader is really the one who aims to get the discussion going, asks different group members about their opinions, and sort of guides the general process of the 7 steps, also has some sort of look at the time. So in that sense, the tutor's role is rather limited, which really puts a lot of responsibility on the students also to decide their own learning path and their own learning development, making the learning in that sense much more student-centered, but also self-directed, and through the participation with other group members, also collaborative. Yes, so basically, how do you do this? As I said, you describe a real or realistic situation. So what does that mean? That can be anything from general discussions that there might be in a field. So it has a constructivist assumption or constructivist approach to learning, meaning that it often looks at how are things currently perceived in the field. So how was the current state of knowledge constructed? So discussions on, just general questions in academic fields that might be unanswered, but also just things that have been unanswered in the past, or questions that you might have as someone who starts working in the field. So how do I organize a society? How do I do a cost-benefit analysis? Such things are then illustrated with a specific example at hand. So let's say you want a corona tracing app, you would be using such a thing and start presenting some of the examples in order to see what are the costs and the benefits, and then introducing all these unfamiliar terms, and students would develop their own way of going about organizing that problem into something that they can grasp. So again, depending on the level of the course, you might be providing literature, or you might leave it open to the students to gather their own knowledge. For example, for a thesis project, where there's more self-study and where students are more advanced, or a course that is just later on in their curriculum, they might already know where they have to go for literature. Whereas if you're working with first semester students, you might be giving quite specific directions of where they want to go. So we have one example from a specific problem description from Freiburg University College, which is only an excerpt of that example. And it is a course on, or an introductory course to the life sciences. So you see here that it's dealing with cell biology, and it's a specific case about tumor research. So students in the first step would be reading the case, and this is an ill-defined problem. So there might be terms that they don't know. It might be simple questions with regards to language. So if you're not familiar with speaking English, you might have questions of what vaccines are, or you might have the questions of what polio is if this is an introductory course to the life sciences and you don't really know what polio actually is. So you start identifying unclear terms and see whether other people in the group can already answer them. You identify the problem, the overarching idea of, so this seems to be a task that's dealing with cells, and students would be asking a more specific questions of what is it that we want to find out or that we want to do. There's often sentences in these problems like leaving researchers with, at the very end of this example, leaving researchers with the false assumption of working with the original cell lines, leading to possibly false conclusions. So there's often some sort of open-ended critique or question included in such texts from which students start. So once they have their problem statement, they would pre-discuss and activate prior knowledge, see what knowledge about cells they, for example, already have, and cluster that eventually into similar sorts of topics, and then forming that into questions that guide the self-study. So then they read their literature or have other sources of answering their learning goals. And then in the last step in their post discussion, they come back together for an hour to post discuss the problem, answer the learning goals, and go back to the problem statement to see if they have a more clear idea about this, about cells and the development of cells in the life sciences, or the role of cell lines and the beginning of tumors. I'm obviously not a biologist. But so these are more or less the steps that are included. And this is one way of going about a problem-based learning scenario. And we also have presented some discussion questions for you, and Sarah has a Menti board, or put these questions on a Menti board. So in different fields, you might have different types of problems. So for discussion, I thought you could be starting to think about what kind of problems your students could be discussing. Similarly, maybe you're already using similar approaches, and as for the prior toolkits, what are the advantages or possibilities and the limitations and drawbacks for implementing the 7-step approach in your particular context?